this computer. Okay. So some preliminary remarks. Where exactly does the Passion narrative begin? Many scholars consider the Last Supper to be part of the narrative. In the early church, the Passion was certainly never narrated without the story of the empty tomb or resurrection appearances. However, to keep this matter manageable, I'm going to follow Raymond Brown's example and leave out the Last Supper, which we say for Holy Thursday, as well as the narratives of the empty tomb and resurrection appearances. The subtitle to his big book, the Death of the Messiah, is From Gethsemane to the Grave. Gospel context. Already in chapter 3, the Pharisees and Herodians were plotting to destroy Jesus. The Markan Jesus has 3 times prophesied his death, typo there, his death. But the disciples didn't understand. His words and actions in the temple in chapter 11 resulted in the priests and scribes plotting against him. In Bethany, shortly before he arrived in Jerusalem, a woman anointed his body for burial. Mark, unlike John, portrays the Last Supper as a Passover. The Passover meal typically ends with hymns and psalms, and Psalms 113 to 118 are called the Great Hallel. Hallel is Hebrew for praise God. These psalms all have that theme. Let's see. I'm going to start, and I'll read. See, we've had a solemn reading. I'm going to try reading this. If it looks like I'm going long, I'll stop my rereading and just give comments. But and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You all will fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Amen, I say to you, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. And they went to the place which was called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." So I will strike the shepherd. This is a quote from Zechariah 13. Unlike many devotional presentations based on medieval piety, the New Testament authors do not stress the pain of the cross. Rather, their concern is the shame of the cross. Using Old Testament language to describe what happened to Jesus, this reference to Zechariah, was a way of saying this was part of God's plan. It wasn't just a tragic mistake, but this was, God was active here. Now, we can't take this too literally, or we get the idea that God was not going to forgive sins until there had been enough blood and gore, and that makes God into a monster. But what it is after something bad happens, like Martin Luther King gets assassinated, and then we see that there's better interracial relations, then with the faith insight, we say that was part of God's plan. That doesn't mean that God wanted James Earl Ray to pull the trigger or for the people to nail nails into Jesus. So don't take that overly literally. Brown's comment, the Markan Passion begins with this gloomy note, and the darkness will intensify until Jesus breathes his last the next day. In all that time, no support will come from those who have been his followers, and he will die alone. Then we have the prayer in Gethsemane. He took Peter with him and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. He said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Brown remarks that sometimes well-meaning preachers try to deny that Jesus was afraid to die. Some philosophers point out the contrast between Jesus and Socrates. Uh, Jesus is beside himself, facing death. Socrates ponders the alternative and calmly drinks the hemlock and dies. Some think this is because the death of Socrates was less painful than the death of Jesus, but Brown sees rather a difference in the biblical attitude toward death and the Greek philosophical attitude. He says, "It is not surprising that either ancients or moderns imbued with Platonic ideals, Plato, the great philosopher, and the Greek philosophical would find Jesus' attitude toward death disgraceful." The Christian answer lies not in underplaying the apprehension of Jesus, but in stressing the importance of life in this world so that death is seen as a distortion and not as a welcome deliverance. That death is seen as an enemy. Paul, even after the resurrection, will say, "The last enemy is death." That's the biblical attitude toward death. And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So Markan triads. Mark likes patterns of three. For example, he records 3 predictions of his death by Jesus. The Markan disciples fall asleep 3 times. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. The Markan disciples are not only weak, they are disobedient. Jesus has commanded them to stay awake. Contrast Luke's version. Luke likes to give the guys a break. Luke omits the commandment by Jesus to stay awake. So his disciples, they might be weak, but they're not disobedient. And also the Lucan disciples fall asleep only once, not 3 times. Many scholars think that Mark's community has suffered persecution. Perhaps Mark was written in Rome shortly after the time of Nero. And we often hear about the martyrs who suffered persecution, but we haven't heard much about the many Christians who denied Jesus during the persecutions. Mark is writing for them. He stresses the weakness of the original disciples. His message is, if God gave these weak disciples a second chance, God will also give you a second chance. Then the betrayal. And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." When he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Master," and he kissed him. and they laid hands on him and seized him. So Judas arrives unexpectedly, interrupting the speech of Jesus. He identifies Jesus with a kiss, and Matthew follows Mark here. The Lucan Judas identifies Jesus, but he never plants the kiss. For Luke, that was just too terrible to dramatize. Judas kissing Jesus. So the Lucan Judas never plants the kiss, and we will see a very different picture in John. The Johannine Jesus does not need to be identified by a kiss or any other way. More on this later. Then there's some sword play. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Mark imagines the swordsman as an anonymous bystander. Often we picture Gethsemane as a place of splendid isolation. At Passover, there were thousands of people camped out on the Mount of Olives. This is one of the reasons why the arresting party needed Judas to find the right small group in the middle of all of these thousands. In Luke, Jesus heals the ear. That's a Lucan theme. In Mark, as in Matthew and John, the poor devil is still bleeding when everybody leaves Gethsemane. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all forsook him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Have you come out? This can also be translated as a question. You have come out. The fulfillment of scriptures. It's a theme for all the evangelists. It's how they deal with the shame of the cross. Here, it also shows Jesus' resignation to his fate. Seeing the resignation of Jesus in this remark, the weak Markan disciples flee. The young man who fled naked, this scene appears only in Mark. Brown notes that at the beginning of the ministry, the disciples had left everything to follow Jesus. This young man is literally leaving everything to get away from Jesus. Still going in chapter 14. Okay. Before the Sanhedrin, they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and scribes assembled, and Peter had followed him at a distance right up to the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. So we have two people introduced in the first two verses here in this scene. Jesus will be questioned by the assembly. Peter will be questioned outside by different people, and their responses differ dramatically. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, and their witness did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." Yet not even so did their testimony agree. Now, as false witnesses, Brown points out that this section in Mark is incoherent. Deliberately or indeliberately, Mark does not say what was false about the testimony. Did Jesus not say anything at all about the destruction of the temple? Or did he claim it would be destroyed, but not that he would be the agent of its destruction? Or did Jesus not make the distinction between made with hands and not made with hands? Brown points out that these adjectives are hard to translate, Greek adjectives hard to translate back into Hebrew or Aramaic, and he thinks that these words represent a later post-resurrectional understanding inserted into the words of Jesus by Mark. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he was silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. Now, question about the Jewish trial. Mark, followed by Matthew, represents two separate trials, one by the Jewish Sanhedrin, the other before Pilate. Jesus receives two condemnations of death, one from the Jews, one from the Romans. Luke and John, by contrast, do not report a formal trial with condemnation of death by the Jewish authorities, only an informal inquest. Typo there. They report only one trial. They report only one trial and one condemnation of death, namely the condemnation by the Roman procurator, Pilate. The silence of Jesus recalls the suffering servant of Isaiah who did not open his mouth. The same suffering servant did not shield his face from buffets and spitting. The use of biblical imagery is a way to deal with the shame of the cross. This is part of God's plan. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? The Blessed One equals God. The high priest is not asking about claims to divine nature. Every king of Israel from David on heard Psalm 2 on the day he was anointed. "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." The day a king was anointed, Mashiach, Christos, he became Son of God in a special way that other Israelites were not. The response, Jesus claims to be the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, and continues with claiming to be the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of the power. And the right hand, the power, is another reverent Jewish way of saying God. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man is the person who's going to judge the world in God's name. So Son of God, Messiah are exalted titles. Son of Man is a very exalted title. Prophesy. Here we have some mark and irony. At the very moment Jesus is being mocked for being a false prophet, his prophecies, his threefold prophecy that he was going to die is now coming true. Then Peter's denial. As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the maids of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene, Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the gateway, and the maids saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But he denied it. And after a little while again, the bystanders said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are Galilean." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the cock crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So the first denial is a pretense not to understand the question of the servant girl. When she persists, Peter actually denies being a follower of Jesus. In the third denial, he began to curse. The RSV says to invoke a curse upon himself. If I if I am one of his disciples, let me be damned. That's a possible meaning. However, it can also meant that he began to curse Jesus to prove, I'll prove I'm not a disciple. May God curse him. Uh, so that's ambiguous, and interpreters come down either way, but it's a very strong third denial. The scene ends with Peter weeping bitterly, repenting. Mark probably hopes that this image will give consolation to those in his community who have denied Jesus during persecution. I'm going to stop recording here.